Basic story you've heard. Actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth made his way into the president's box at Ford's Theater on the 14th of April, 1865. There he shot Abraham Lincoln, yelling, "Sic semper tyrannis, revenge for the South." He then jumped to the stage below and escaped into the night of Washington, D.C., starting one of the largest manhunts in American history, a 12-day-long sojourn that would end with him being shot in a tobacco barn in Bowling Green, Virginia. However, the story is far more insane with the cast of characters, some clearly mad, others driven by blind allegiance to a cause or a man, but each driven to complete their mission as they saw fit. I'm Mick Biddick, and this is History is Criminal. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the other events of April 14th, 1865, the hunt for the assassins, and the people behind the murder and the manhunt. John Wilkes Booth was born to be famous. His father, Julius Brutus Booth, was a well-known actor. His brother, Edwin, might have been the best-known actor of his age. Booths would have been much like the Hemsworths of their time, with Edwin in the position of Chris, and while John Wilkes was no slouch in the acting world. He made his debut at the age of 19 playing King Lear. A heartthrob, it was said he was the first actor to ever have his clothes torn by adoring fans. He was also a Southern sympathizer, not rare in Washington, D.C., but unlike others, he had ties to the Confederate Secret Service. Booth was tied to a plot to kidnap Lincoln and exchange him for high-ranking Confederate prisoners. When Lee surrendered to Grant on the 9th of April, 1865, that plan was thrown out. According to one account, Booth's plan turned to murder when he heard Lincoln give an impromptu speech. In this speech, Lincoln spoke about the granting of political rights to formerly enslaved African Americans. At this revelation, Booth reportedly said, "This means the vote for the Negro. Lincoln must die." The plan, however, was far more complicated than most people know. The plot included not only killing Lincoln, but also Vice President Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, and the Secretary of State William Seward. In short, decapitating the whole Union government. The plan was set to be carried out at 10 p.m. on April 14th. While Booth would infamously succeed in his assassinating Lincoln, the rest of the plot fell apart like a house of cards on an unbalanced washing machine. Grant was supposed to accompany Lincoln to the theater that day, but his wife convinced him to take the train to Baltimore to see their children instead. Even though the Secret Service was not part of the presidential security detail until 1901, after the assassination of William McKinley, Lincoln's personal security was surprisingly light on the 14th of April, 1865. His personal bodyguard, Ward Hill Layman, was not on duty that night. Lincoln had sent Layman on an errand to Richmond, Virginia. Before leaving, Layman had pleaded with Lincoln not to go out the night without him acting as security. In Layman's place was John Parker. Parker was a Washington, D.C. police officer with a reputation for misconduct, including drinking on duty. Parker left his post outside the presidential box that night, first to watch the play, and then he went next door to a saloon at intermission. This was, ironically, the same saloon that Booth had been drinking at earlier that night before going to Ford's Theater. Parker would fail to return to his duty that night. Booth must have had a hard time believing his luck, seeing no one guarding the presidential box. Booth slipped into the box so quietly that no one heard his entrance, or was aware of his presence until he fired that fatal shot. He was even able to jam the door with a piece of wood. Then, stepping deeper into the box and placing the .44 caliber Derringer pistol only a few feet from the back of the president's head, the report of the pistol would have been heard by everybody in the quiet theater. The shock was broken by the screams of Mary Todd Lincoln. Major Henry Rathbone and a date had accompanied Lincoln in Grant's place. Rathbone would fight with Booth after Lincoln's shooting. Armed with a large knife in addition to the Derringer pistol, Booth seriously injured Rathbone, cutting his bicep nearly in half. Booth's planned escape was in keeping with his flair for the dramatic, leaping from the presidential box to the stage below. Upon landing on the stage, he would actually fracture his leg, but that didn't stop him from limping across the stage towards the back door of the theater, where a stagehand waited, holding Booth's horse. Then he galloped off into the Washington night, headed towards Maryland. Lewis Powell and David Harold went to the home of Secretary of State William Seward. Powell went to the front door while Harold held his horse. The door was answered by Seward's servant, William Bell. Seward himself was in bed recovering from a carriage accident that he'd been in just a few days earlier. Powell claimed to have medicine for the secretary. Bell said he would take the medication. Powell refused, forcing his way past. Seward's son, Frederick, met Powell on the steps, attempting to stop him. Powell then pulled a revolver from his pocket and struck Frederick on the head hard enough that he was in a coma for 6 days after the attack. Seward's bodyguard, George Robinson, came on the scene. Fighting Powell, Robinson was struck on the head with the Bowie knife, temporarily knocking him from the fight. Reaching Seward's room, Powell leapt on Seward and attacked him so violently that Seward became pinned between the bed and the wall. This might have saved his life, as Powell rained down blows with the knife, but failed to land any fatal strikes. Robinson recovered enough to pull Powell off of Seward. Then, racing out of the house, Powell found that Harold had ran off, taking his horses with him once the fighting had started. He then had to make his escape through Washington, D.C., a town that Powell was unfamiliar with. George Azerodt had stalked Vice President Johnson, renting a room at the Kirkwood house where Johnson was living. On the 14th, Azerodt inquired with the front desk about Johnson's whereabouts. The clerk reported that a drunk man was asking a great deal of questions about the vice president. It would not have been hard to find Johnson, but when it came to act, Azerodt seemed to lose his nerve, never making an attempt on Johnson's life. Instead, finding a good, strong drink. Michael O'Laughlin, like Azerodt, failed to even make a move on his target. While officially charged with plotting to kill Grant, more evidence points to him actually targeting Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton would become the person in charge of the manhunt for the killers. Stanton had started off as a critic of Lincoln, but over the years had become one of his most fierce defenders and loyal friends. But on the 14th, instead of carrying out his mission, O'Laughlin got drunk. Very drunk. At approximately 10:30, Booth reached the Naval Yard Bridge leaving D.C. for Maryland. The bridge had been closed to all civilian passage after 9 p.m. Stopped and questioned by the sentries, Booth convinced the soldiers he was traveling home to nearby Beantown. Again, don't forget, Booth was considered a fantastic actor. Booth was allowed to pass, and 5 minutes later, a man calling himself Smith reached the checkpoint. Smith, who was in fact Harold, said he was returning from a rough night on the town and just wanted to get home to his house in White Plains. The sentry allowed the criminal to pass into the Maryland night. News had not reached the sentries on the bridge until a short time after both Booth and Harold had passed. Near midnight, Booth and Harold reached a tavern owned by Mary Surratt in Surrattville, Maryland. They met with John Lloyd, the man who ran the tavern. A few months earlier, John Surratt Jr. and Harold had stored a cache of weapons in the inn. Upon arrival, Lloyd retrieved 2 carbines for Booth and Harold. Never leaving his horse, Booth took several shots of whiskey while Harold gathered provisions. Then the two took off into the night. It was only a few hours after the shooting that military investigators traced Booth to the home of Mary Surratt on High Street in Washington, D.C. Booth was known to be staying in Surratt's home before the assassination. Awoken at 4 in the morning, Mary Surratt was questioned about the possible location of Booth. She gave no help to the detectives, and then they left. A boarder overheard Mary say, after the investigators left, that Booth was an instrument in the hands of the Almighty to punish this proud and litigious people. 3 days later, the investigators returned to Surratt's home. While Mary was being questioned, Powell came to her door carrying a pickaxe. Powell claimed to be a workman hired to dig a ditch for Surratt. However, Surratt claimed that she did not know Powell and stated she had not hired anyone to dig any ditches. Both Powell and Surratt were arrested. While in custody, Powell was positively identified by William Bell as the man who had attacked Secretary Seward. Neither was willing to give the authorities any information, if in fact they had any to give. On the 17th of April, 3 more arrests were made. Edmund Spangler was arrested. Theatergoers tied him to Booth. It was also shown that he tried to convince a stagehand who witnessed Booth's escape to lie about the direction Booth had fled in. Sam Arnold was arrested when his name was found on letters in Booth's hotel room. The letters tied Arnold to the kidnapping plot. After being arrested, Arnold confessed to being part of the kidnapping plot and discussed meeting with Booth, Surratt, O'Laughlin, Azeroth, and a man calling himself Mosby, possibly Powell, and a 6th man who gave no name. Michael O'Laughlin turned himself in Baltimore. George Azeroth was captured at his cousin's house in Germantown, Maryland. The day after Lincoln was shot, the desk clerk from the Kirkwood house reported Azeroth's inquiry as to the location of the vice president. A search of his room uncovered weapons and a bank book in the name of John Wilkes Booth. It was seen that the plotters had made very little attempt to cover their tracks. So this is twice. First, Sam Arnold, then Azeroth, where they literally kept written documentation that shows their connection to the plot. I'm not a criminal mastermind, but I would guess probably keeping written documentation of your connection to the crime is not a smart move. Meanwhile, the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth had become a military affair, with Edwin Stanton commanding thousands of law enforcement and soldiers, all hunting for the assassin. On the 18th of April, Booth was tracked to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd said that around 4 in the morning on April 15th, 2 men came to his door, one in great pain from a broken leg. Alexander Levitt led the questioning of Mudd. His story was that he had never met the men before in his life, and he set the broken bone and made a crude set of crutches for the injured man. However, it would turn out the doctor had lied when he said what direction the men had headed off in after leaving his home. 3 days later, Levitt returned to Mudd's home and searched. He located a booth with J.W. Wilkes written in it. Again, why would you keep the boot, Dr. Mudd? Mudd claimed he had never met Booth, but his neighbors told investigators that they had seen the doctor with Booth months earlier. He was then arrested as a co-conspirator. Again, really, he hung on to John Wilkes Booth's boot for 6 days after the assassination. Booth and Harold had been slowly making their way across Maryland and Virginia, often sleeping in fields and barns. On the 25th of April, they met a man named Willie Jett and crossed the Rappahannock River in Virginia. It seems someone had seen Jett traveling with the 2 men, who happened to be the 2 most wanted fugitives in the world, because that night, men burst into Jett's hotel room. Leading them was Everton Conger. Conger demanded that Jett tell him where the 2 men he had crossed the river with went. Jet knew who these men were. Harold had even told him, "We, the assassinators of the president, yonder is John Wilkes Booth, the man who killed Lincoln." Harold and Booth most likely believed they would be protected as heroes now that they were in the heart of the Confederacy. Jet wasted no time in telling the soldiers what they wanted to know. The two had headed towards Port Royal and the home of a man named Mr. Garrett. At the Garrett farm, a small army had assembled. With Conger in charge, Garrett, an elderly man, was questioned as to the location of the two men. He claimed they had headed into the woods. Conger didn't believe him and called for a rope, saying, "Put that man up the top of those locust trees." At this, Garrett's son came forward, yelling that the men were in the barn. Booth and Harold heard the excitement at the house and attempted to flee the barn, but found the door locked. Garrett's feared that the criminals might try to steal their horses, so they actually locked Booth and Harold in the barn. By the time they were able to force the lock, the barn was surrounded. Stanton had given orders to bring Booth in alive. It was believed Lincoln's assassination was a conspiracy that went to the very highest positions of the former Confederate government, and Stanton wanted to question Booth. Booth, it seems, had other plans. Conger gave the men 5 minutes to surrender. Booth countered with having Conger pull his men back, and Booth would come out fighting. This plan was rejected. Instead, Conger said that if Booth and Harold didn't come out, he would light the barn on fire. As Conger ordered pine boughs brought to the barn, Booth yelled, "There's a man in here who wants to come out." Then, after Booth called him a damn coward, Harold came out of the barn. Conger then ordered the barn to be set ablaze. Through the windows, Booth was seen, carbine in hand, heading towards the barn door. Sergeant Boston Corbett raised his rifle and shot, hitting Booth in the neck. Soldiers then entered the barn and pulled a dying John Wilkes Booth from the flames. The wound would be fatal, but it would take Booth nearly 3 hours to die. Struggling to speak, Booth finally said, "Tell my mother I died for my country." Passing in and out of consciousness, he repeatedly said to the soldiers, "Kill me." Paralyzed from the neck down, Booth asked the soldiers to raise his hand, which the soldiers did. Booth looked at his hands and then said, "Useless, useless." Then he died on the ground in Bowling Green, Virginia on April 26, 1865. John Surratt Jr. had escaped to Canada, would then make his way to England and Rome. He was arrested in Egypt in 1866 and transported to the United States to be tried in a civilian court in 1867. The other living conspirators would stand trial before a military tribunal in 1865. It was debated whether or not the trial should take place in a civilian or military court, but Stanton pushed for a military court. He said he wanted the conspirators convicted and hanged before Lincoln was buried. Lincoln would be buried on the 4th of May, before the tribunal had even started. The trial lasted 7 weeks and saw 371 witnesses called. During the trial, it came to light that the Confederate government had agents in Canada that had conspired to commit acts of terror across the Union. In addition to the plot to kidnap Lincoln, it had been discovered at the highest levels of the Confederate government. However, Jefferson Davis or no other Confederate officials were ever charged in the conspiracy. 8 people, 7 men and 1 woman, were held on charges related to the assassination and attempted assassinations. It was shown that each played a role in the conspiracy, though the evidence against Dr. Mudd and Mary Surratt seemed very shaky. Mudd and Mary could be placed in the Surratt home during the planning of the assassination, but their direct involvement still remained murky. For Mary Surratt, George Azerodt, Lewis Powell, and David Harold, each were sentenced to be hanged. Their sentences were carried out on the 7th of July, 1865. Sam Arnold, Dr. Mudd, and Michael O'Laughlin were sentenced to hard labor for life. Edmund Spangler was convicted of only helping Booth escape and was sentenced to just 6 years. John Surratt Jr. would be tried in a civilian court in 1867. His trial ended in a hung jury with 8 voting not guilty and 4 voting guilty. Surratt was released from prison and went on a public speaking tour proclaiming his innocence. On the 1st of March, 1869, President Johnson pardoned Dr. Mudd, Spangler, and Arnold. O'Laughlin had died in prison from a yellow fever outbreak. Sam Arnold was the last of the conspirators to pass away in 1906 after having written a detailed account of the plot to kidnap Lincoln. John Parker, the man who had abandoned his post on the night of April 14th, was never disciplined for failing to do his duty that night. There was no written policy stating what he should have done in that situation. He would be reassigned briefly to Mary Todd Lincoln's security detail before she left the White House. After Mary Todd left the White House, Parker was allowed to return to work with the Washington, D.C. police, but was fired in 1868 for falling asleep on duty. Apparently, they actually had a written policy for that one. He would die in 1890 from pneumonia and was buried in an unmarked grave. Major Rathbone, who had fought with Booth in the presidential box in Ford's Theater, would suffer from mental anguish for the rest of his life, possibly PTSD. His story will be both fascinating and tragic. Leaving the military, he fell on hard times, unable to find work until he was given a post as a consul in Germany. While living in Germany, on the 23rd of December, 1883, he attacked his family. His wife attempting to protect her children from the deranged father. He then shot and stabbed his wife. Then Rathbone turned the knife on himself, stabbing himself 5 times in the chest. However, none of the wounds would prove fatal. He would spend the rest of his life in a hospital for the criminally insane in Germany and died on the 14th of August, 1911. The craziest story, however, belongs to Sergeant Boston Corbett, the man who fired the shot that killed John Wilkes Booth. Corbett was an English immigrant who had his life fall apart when his wife died in childbirth. Corbett decided to drink himself to death, but a street preacher saved him. Corbett then became a street preacher himself and took a vow of chastity. To ensure that vow, he would castrate himself with a pair of scissors. You heard that right. Self-castration with scissors. Then he walked to a nearby church to take part in a church service. So just in case you think you misheard that, he used scissors to castrate himself, then went to church. When the war broke out, Corbett volunteered for the Union Army and would re-enlist 3 times. He was captured and housed at the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia until released on a prisoner exchange in 1864. In April 1865, his unit was assigned to hunt for John Wilkes Booth, despite orders that Booth be taken alive by Secretary Stanton. Corbett would still be declared a hero and given a share of the reward for capturing Booth. Corbett's life gets even crazier from here. Not self-castration crazy, but normal crazy. Having worked as a hatter, Corbett had been exposed to a lot of mercury. By the 1870s, he was showing signs of madness, likely from mercury poisoning. Adding to his troubles, there were stories that people who had idolized Booth wanted to kill Corbett. Rumors had even floated that Booth had actually survived and was out to get Corbett. Now, you would think Corbett, being present at Booth's death, wouldn't buy into these rumors, but again, at this point, his brain is pretty fried from mercury poisoning. Corbett would speak often about his enemies and he was constantly armed, including when he even gave a church sermon one time. When he began to speak, he pulled two pistols and set them on the pulpit as he began to give his sermon. He had received threatening letters saying they were going to kill him. One of these letters was even signed John Wilkes Booth. By the 1880s, he was confined to an asylum. One day, a boy stopped at the gate to make a delivery to the asylum. Corbett was able to run out the gate and jump on the horse. He was last seen jumping a train heading west. After that, Corbett vanishes into the pages of history. Did the conspiracy to kill Lincoln include high-ranking members of the Confederate government? Or were Booth and his compatriots acting on their own accord? We might never know the full truth. Perhaps it died that night with Booth on the cold ground in Bowling Green, Virginia. Maybe the answer waits in some long-lost document gathering dust in the archives somewhere. In any case, the story surrounding the assassination of Abraham Lincoln is full of far more than what we're typically told in our high school history classes. This has been History is Criminal. Join us in 2 weeks as we dig into the tragic death of Mary Fagan and the horrible miscarriage of justice that would lead to the lynching of Leo Frank.